Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Feature Complete,
where we talk about game dev and everything related to it.
I'm one of your hosts, MadChirpy.
And I'm Muddasheep, aka Philip. And today's topic is scope creep and scope management, right?
Indeed.
So the first thing that we want to talk about is what defines scope, right? In terms of our projects as well. Maybe you can start by defining it in terms of your project, like Shroud of Gloom, which is going to come out soon. What do you think is inside of the scope and what do you think is outside of the scope?
Yeah, so I think for my game, Shroud of Gloom, I've actually managed to keep the scope relatively decent. If we should start with the definition, scope is basically your plan for the features and the content in the game, right? Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair, yes.
So as someone making like a fairly linear point and click, which you can read as almost one input type game, I think it inherently is actually relatively small in scope. I don't know, what would you say about your game?
The game I'm currently working on is still called Faith and Despair. It has been out since last November, and currently I'm updating it for the rest of the year. And I'm saying that because the updates that I'm currently working on, you could say that they were kind of in the original scope of the project. This topic kind of overlaps with the topic that we had last time. But the reason I'm saying it is that you have to have kind of a vision for the game of how it kind of looks like in the end. And that I think is the definition of the scope, because then it's like, yeah, you have a very strong goal, and then you can, every time you get an idea, then you can ask the idea, hey, are you part of the scope? Are you part of the goal of where we want to go or not? I think this is kind of how I would define it.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and maybe potentially an argument as to why game design documents are good. Because you could argue that that is like defining the scope before you start. Did you do a design document for Faith in Despair?
No.
You didn't? Okay.
I didn't do a design document because, I did have a bit of a kind of a rough plan in the beginning, but I never really sat down and said, you know what, I'm going to have 6 starter decks. In fact, in the beginning, I was like, you know what, I'm going to have 20 starter decks. And it just it was a complete moonshot, basically. I'm going to have this and this and this. And in the end, it has like a fourth of what I initially thought I was going to add to the game. Yes, I mean, in terms of game design documents, yes, I think it can define the scope of a project. But, and here's another thing that I would like to say. In terms of creative projects, I think it is harder to keep a scope than maybe in a physical project where you, for example, you're building a house or you're building a pool or whatever. I mean, those can get out of proportions as well, but you have to have blueprints and they kind of have to be like this, like what you planned. There can still be additional requests or whatever, but I would actually say additional requests doing building a house is kind of like scope creep. But it kind of is, you know, this is the thing that I wanted, this is the thing we plan, and this is kind of what it looks like. And in terms of a creative project, like making music or writing a story or whatever, or making a game, I think something that we also touched upon last time is the project will kind of talk to you. And even though you have kind of initially defined the scope or defined the general idea of where you want to go by the end of it, you sometimes will kind of veer off the path that you have decided to go on. Isn't it right?
No, I agree fully. And to actually kind of argue against myself here, I would say that's also my counter argument against doing like too strict game design documents. Because it can be quite nice to have a general direction and an idea of the game you want to do, the features you want to have, and so on. But, you know, with the whole concept of prototyping as well as like actually making the game, like it's very hard to sit down and just idealize the perfect game in your head and then just go, okay, I'm just gonna execute this perfectly planned out idea now. Like, I don't think in the real world it doesn't really happen that way. because as you said, the project is going to basically tell you where it wants to go, and you're gonna realize that some of your initial ideas actually maybe doesn't work for this game, and so on. So in terms of, just to finish on the GDD topic, I think the way I view it, I think they can be helpful to kind of maybe cement the original idea a little bit, but I also think that they should be fairly open-ended.
I agree. In terms of working as a solo developer or in a team, I think for a team, even if it's just 2 people or something like that working together, I think then having a central document to at least, always fall back on when, there's something up for discussion and nobody knows who's right now. And then it's like, yeah, but in the GDD, we decided that this is kind of the case. I think for a team, it kind of makes sense to have at least a little bit of a GDD. But again, as you said, it needs to be a document that is alive, that, just keeps being changed alongside the project.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Like, if anything, that the GDD shouldn't be something written in stone that you necessarily always have to follow down to the T, but it should more so, it should grow and change with the project. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we have defined what a scope is, or how we would think our projects have kind of a scope. I think so. The next point on our list would be, what is scope creep? And have you experienced scope creep before? Are you experiencing it right now in a project, or how would you define it?
I think I am in some regards, definitely. I mean, if we take the GDD back again, like, I did make a GDD initially.
Oh.
And looking back at it now, it's not even remotely the same game as my GDD said. So I have definitely not changed my GDD with time. I wrote it once to kind of get my ideas out, and then I never looked at it again, and now the game is completely different. But I'm also not sure. It depends a little bit on how you define scope creep. Because for me, I think the way I would put it is that I think I maybe see it in 2 different ways, where scope creep is either something that, like, a feature, content, or a system, whatever it might be, that you cannot afford to implement, or you're just, like, underestimating the time it's going to take, or like something along those lines. So basically, you're underestimating the workload. But then maybe more importantly, I think the other thing is also that it probably is a feature that's not inherently necessary. Like, if you're spending a bunch of time working on a feature that's not actually going to contribute to the value of the game, I would probably consider that scope creep, if you know what I mean.
Right. Yes. I would say, so in terms of going a little bit back to the definition of scope, what is also part of this definition of scope is what you just said, like what the project actually needs. And I think a big part of that, a big part of making a game, is also making sure that it's a good product. And I know this sounds kind of cold or whatever, because it's not really part of the creative process or whatever, but making a game also holds some expectations in the players, right? Because they expect a pause menu, they expect to be able to change certain things or whatever. And I think this is also inside of the scope. Like, when you are working on a good menu or something like that, I think this is kind of not even nice to have, and I think this is an absolute must-have.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's like, I think you can say that vast majority of at least new developers and stuff, I would suspect heavily underestimate the importance of, like, a good menu and good settings in the game and so on. Because it doesn't feel like it might not feel like it's a part of the game itself, but it is inherently a part of, like, the project and the entire scope, right? And it does kind of, if anything, it's the first impression, right?
Yeah, the first impression is really, really important. Like people decide if they like something or not in like the first 2 seconds.
Yeah, exactly.
It's you don't have a lot of time, especially nowadays. Time is very scarce nowadays.
I do suppose with the whole, like, the creep part of the word as well, there's something where I suppose it's something where it's not initially planned, and it's something that you kind of accidentally almost starts creeping in on you with time, right? And you start increasing the scope. But that's where I think it gets a little bit tricky too, because I wouldn't say, as to what we were referring to before, like the project is always going to change just because it wasn't planned out. And even though it's like a new feature, doesn't inherently mean that I would consider it scope creep.
Exactly. That is a big thing in especially creative projects, because sometimes you stumble upon these happy accidents and you're like, I really have to add this to the game because I honestly think this is going to make it better. I honestly think, and this is, I think, a good way of estimating if something that you're going to add is having a huge value or whatever, or is actually scope creep. Because if you ask, hey, what I'm currently doing, how much value is it adding compared to the time that I'm investing? I think this is very, very, very important to step back every now and then and be really honest with yourself. Is it really a good idea to add, I don't know, a local multiplayer feature for a single player adventure, point and click adventure? Probably not. I mean, it sounds kind of cool on paper, but it's not a thing. It's like, maybe Shaun of Gloom, local multiplayer. But yeah.
No, I think it's a good point.
I have thought of one example of where I think I could have stumbled in the scope creep. For example, so I was making a Half-Life modification back in 2001, 2002, and very close to finishing. I was like, there was a part in the game where you were just walking around very wide grass fields and whatever. And I was like, you know what would be really cool? Windmills. Because I was riding the train every now and then, so every weekend to visit my girlfriend. And I just saw windmills every time, and it looks so cool and so majestic. I'm like, I need to add windmills to all of my grass levels. And I was like, okay, how much time is this going to cost me? Because I already had kind of a deadline. I think I had already announced when it's going to come out. So I'm like, okay, I need this in my game because I think it's going to really value up these maps. But I sat down, I'm like, okay, what is the easiest or what is the simplest way to adding this, where it still kind of gets the idea across, it gets the job done, it adds the value, but it doesn't cost me a lot of time. And by the end of it, I was like, okay, I had just the simplest windmills in it with a bit of a sound that I just copy-pasted from another part of the project. And honestly, this part can now, it couldn't even exist without the windmills. Like people recognize it because of the windmills now. So this is one example where I'm like, okay, this was really, really important for the project in hindsight. I didn't really know it back then. I was just like, yeah, this is kind of cool. You always have to ask yourself, okay, I want to add this, but what is the simplest way of doing this without, throwing the project into a rabbit hole or whatever?
I think that's the kind of tricky thing, though, because as you said, that might have been something that seemed like scope creep, but in hindsight kind of wasn't. So, but could it then also be the other way? Like, you might think something is a really good idea, and it is going to add value, and you spend a bunch of time implementing it, and then in hindsight realize that, no, wait, actually, this was scope creep.
I have an example for this as well.
Oh, you do? Go ahead.
I've made a puzzle game, which was the game that I made before Faith and Despair. And at some point, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to add a level editor. A level editor always sounds kind of nice, because it's like, then players can make their own levels and this game kind of will live on forever or whatever. In hindsight, the only redeeming thing about the level editor was that I added a kind of a UI menu system or whatever that I was able to reuse in Faith and Despair. So in hindsight, it kind of helped the new project get off really, really quickly from the start. But in terms of was it worth it for the previous project? I don't think so. Here's another thing, a small thing. We even had to remove it for the console release because getting a rating for user-made levels is really, really difficult. It just, makes it very difficult in terms of, because people can just draw whatever they want, basically, right?
Yeah, no, I see what you mean. It's harder
So
to
it was not worth it.
moderate the content.
Exactly. But do you have your game is not released yet, but do you have like one thing that you think was kind of scope creep in retrospect?
Yes. I mean, you could argue that half my game is scope creep if we're gonna go by the unintended features, right? Because I've added a ton of stuff to it. But personally, of course, I don't consider it that way because I think a lot of the stuff I've added has had a direct impact on the value of the game. But one example that I did briefly mention last time as well that I think I would consider as scope creep is definitely the battery system for the flashlights. And it's interesting because I think I was trying to solve an issue in the game, but it was just the completely wrong type of implementation for it. Because the way I see it, I mean, I think part of it was also that, like, oh, it sounds cool. Like, oh, you got batteries and you have to handle your, you basically end up having like battery management in the game to make sure it doesn't run out and so on. But I think the root issue I wanted to tackle was having enough items to spread out in the house so there's like a reason to look around. Because for like the puzzle progression and so on, I only have a set amount of items that the player needs to find. But since batteries were consumable, it gave me an item that I could always throw out when I was like, it feels like there should be some reward for looking around here. So, I can just toss out a little battery. But then, when you start thinking about it, it's kind of insane to build this like entire system around like battery management and the flashlight when what I really wanted was a collectible item. Like, the only thing I was looking for is something to pick up. And I built this entire system around it that, in hindsight, I think was completely unnecessary. Which is not only unnecessary, I think it actually decreased the value of the game. I think it made the game worse for multiple reasons. Humans in general, love minimaxing. And they want to min-max the shit out of everything.
Yeah.
So naturally what ended up happening is that, majority of players would play through the game without barely using the flashlight. They would constantly keep it off because they want to save as much battery as possible for, like, in case I need it later. And, this causes a bunch of issues, even, like, meta issues, where, like, some of the first YouTube videos that were posted you can barely see the game because the person playing the game is walking around without the flashlight on when they're like outside a house and stuff, which is like the beginning of the game. The most important part of the video is like pitch black because they don't want to waste battery. And I tried multiple ways of combating this. I was like, okay, I'm just gonna double the amount of batteries. I'll throw out batteries like everywhere, because obviously, if people see that I have like 7 batteries in my inventory, they're gonna use one, right? And no, because people just love min-maxing. So in the end, I realized that the only like proper solution was to completely get rid of the system and then implement something that more so specifically targeted the issue I was trying to solve, which is why I now have collectible items instead. It removes all of the cons but keeps all of the pros, basically.
Yeah, sounds like you really found something that could have hindered your project even more. But I think this might actually go into the next subtopic here. Like, how do you figure out that what you're currently working on is actually scope creep. What do you think? Like, I mean, in your case, you kind of saw the YouTube players and whatever, but yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that is the trickiest part, which is, just looking at it in general. If you would ask any developer what they're working on at the moment, it's very rare for them to actually like fully, genuinely admit that I am doing completely unnecessary scope creep for the game. Like most of the time, we do think we are implementing something that's going to increase the value, right? Because, the argument would be, otherwise, why are you really doing it? If you don't think it's going to have any impact on the game, then you probably wouldn't be spending a bunch of time on this.
I don't know. So, for example, somebody working on a fighting game or just a 3D action game, whatever, and then they implement a movement system or kind of a weapon system, a shooting system, and then you're like, well, it doesn't feel perfect yet. I'm going to rewrite everything because now that I've learned and now I know so much, I'm going to rewrite everything from scratch, and now it's going to be even better. Do you think that's scope creep or not?
It's tricky because if I'm allowed to take a little bit of a cheeky take on it, I could almost say like it depends on the result.
Right.
Because I think that was maybe a little bit what I was trying to alluding to before or whatever, where like I think one of the reasons why it's so hard to figure out if something is or isn't scope creep is because you kind of don't know until the end result is here, or at least until you've battled it for a bit. Because like obviously when I was working on the battery system, I thought this is like the perfect system for my game. If you would have asked me, I definitely didn't think it was scope creep at that time. It's only like in hindsight that I actually realized that this is not solving the issue I'm trying to battle here. So it's unnecessary, i.e. scope creep.
It is kind of hard to say because we said in the beginning that for creative projects, it is, I think, even harder to define than it is for maybe a software project where it already is kind of hard to define. You kind of expect a certain result. Maybe a button is there, but a lot of things around it can explode. But for a creative project and for my projects, I think I always try to have a vision. So I'm here, right? I'm here in the south and I want to go north. Here's the finished project. And I kind of know how it is going to look like. And whenever I work on a task, I will be like, you know what? Is this going to take me a step further to the goal or towards the goal? Or is it going to take me sideways? Is it a side step or is it a step towards the goal? I think this is what I'm asking myself whenever I work on something. For example, I mean, bug fixes is a thing, right? If you're fixing a bug, you kind of feel like you're sidestepping, but it is actually good for the project because people will just uninstall or refund or whatever. So this is bug fixing is kind of within scope. I mean, this sounds kind of obvious, but even in bugs, you can be like, you know what, this is a really hard edge case over here. Not a lot of people are going to see that. Even then, you can kind of prioritize. I always want to work on something where I take a step towards the goal. I think this is what I always prioritize. Now, you might say, does it really matter if the cards look good or whatever, or does it really matter if I redo the entire UI interface a third time? I think so. A lot of the reasons, a lot of the issues or a lot of the tasks that I did where I thought, okay, this is actually now something that I have to do is because of player feedback. So I test something, I put out a demo, and then I get feedback. And if I hear something for like 10 times or 20 times, then I'm like, okay, wait a minute. I wasn't going to put this on the priority list. I wasn't going to put it inside of the scope. But external feedback is showing me this is really, really important. So this is now inside of the scope. This has to be there. And again, I mentioned it earlier, it's kind of like a must-have list and a nice-to-have list, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, how do you define it? So it is really hard to say. You could argue that, I don't know, adding voice acting or whatever to my game was not that important, but that was already past launch. So it is really hard to say. Before the launch, I was a bit more tough. I was like, you know what? I'm going to have this deadline. And until then, I got to do whatever it takes to get this done, no matter what. And if you're setting yourself a deadline, I think then you have to make really, really tough decisions. I think this is actually what wakes you up a little bit.
I think you did touch on something pretty important there, I would say, which is that I actually do think that playtesting might be one of the better ways to actually find out if something is scope creep. Because then you can see in real time whether this thing actually adds value or whether it's something players even want and so on. Because now when I think back to it, like the reason I realized that the battery system in my game was bad was directly because of playtesting. Because obviously I have a bunch of advantages here. I know exactly where all the batteries are. I know how long they're gonna last. As the developer, that's easy. So I wasn't min-maxing. I knew exactly how many batteries I could use and how much I could keep the light on and so on. But it wasn't until I saw people interact with the game that I realized that, oh, not only is this a potential unnecessary feature, but it's making players have an experience that I don't want them to have, frankly,
Right, that makes sense, yes.
I think maybe in terms of identifying scope, I feel like potentially the scope creeps that's the easiest to identify might be the stuff where the workload is just obviously too massive.
Yeah.
I think these other unnecessary features and stuff that part of scope creep I think is harder, or when you're unsure if it's gonna improve or decrease the value of the game. But if you take something let's say you're making a Pokemon game, and say that you want to have 50 creatures, do you want to do evolutions for them as well? In that case, okay, how many do you want? You want to have 3 evolutions? Now we're talking 150, and then implementing the sound effects, the art, the animations. That can be something where it maybe is easier to spot that, when you start thinking through the actual implementation of it, you can be there's no way I, as a one-man team, is going to have time to implement all of this.
That's a good point. I think I mentioned it before. Originally, for Fate and Despair, I wanted to have 20 or so starter decks because I thought it's going to be easy. And my main inspiration was kind of Balatro, where Balatro has very easy or very simple settings where it's now you just have 1 more gold at the start or something like that, very simple settings. But it kind of grew into something where people expected something different from starter decks. They thought of starter decks as characters to play, like in Slay the Spire. So I was like, oh, wait a minute. I cannot just do a simple one-liner here. I need to actually make sure that you feel vastly different, have different movesets and whatever. I actually feel like a character that you can play. This happened. So this is a bit of a weird one because, again, originally I thought I was going to add 20, but after implementing the 4th or 5th, I'm like, these need a lot more time than I thought. So I'm going to release the game with maybe 5 or 6.
But would you say, was that a workload challenge or more so a design challenge? Was it too difficult to make enough variety in it? Or do you think that it was just you would not have had the time to do it?
I think it's a little bit of both. You can sit down and think of I don't know, a bunch of starter deck designs. Now, whether or not they work actually is a different question. So the difficult thing about those is you kind of have to make a prototype first, see if they play well, and that usually takes a lot of time. Like sometimes, I will give you an example. The last deck that I added was the gambler deck, where all of the cards have dice, and so there's a bunch of things that need to happen to actually make it a viable deck, or actually make it a solvable deck where you actually can deal damage and whatever. And that took a long time because I was like, I really like this. I really like that the cards have dice. There is something there. And it took me much longer than the first 5 starter decks, the first 5 characters, if you will, because I at this point I kind of realized that it needs to play really, really differently. It needs to offer new to actually give the player value, and especially at this point in the game. So I think it is both. So I realized that there's a bit of an increase in both design challenge and also in terms of time investment. So the more you add, the more different it needs to be. The more, I don't know, high quality variations of spells it needs to have. The more art it needs to have, because it kind of is exponential at this point. So I am going to add one more, but I am already realizing that I'm right, because this is going to take even longer and even more time to code.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think generally speaking, the most dangerous type of systems and implementations, content, whatever it might be, are the ones where you might not realize that it exponentially increases the amount of work you have to do. Which is
absolutely,
that's the ones that are the easiest to underestimate, I think.
Yeah. In terms of features that kind of were not as big as I thought, was adding voice lines. That was relatively straightforward. Originally, I was like, yes, I'm going to add voice acting for 30 cutscenes. That is going to be a huge time sink. But to be fair, I had a friend of mine work on the voice line, so that helped me a lot. That was taking a lot of time. But even like on the coding side, it was like not even half a day. Just add a system and then put off the wave files into place. That I thought originally this was completely out of scope and would just derail everything. But once I sat down, and here's something actually that will help you in figuring out if something is scope creep or not. If you sit down and you think of a feature and you actually plan out all of the individual steps that you would have to take for this feature to be implemented, I think once you see this on paper, and I actually recommend doing this on paper with a pen, if you plan out the tiny steps, like break the task down in tiny steps, then you will see, wait a minute, over here in step number 10, it is a huge step that I completely overlooked when I originally thought about this idea. So if you just walk through it mentally, what you would have to do, I think this is one of the things that you can avoid scope creep. And then what you can do, you can plan around it. It's like, oh, step number 10 is kind of huge. What can I do to simplify it, right? I think this is a very true way of figuring it out.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Because I think a lot of the time if we start working on something that is scope creep, it's usually because maybe we haven't actually thought through the implementation of it enough yet. And just as a small side point, I would also agree that with voice acting, because I did end up adding that as well. It was something that I was very stubborn about at first. There's probably multiple clips of me out there saying that I am definitely never adding voice acting to the game. Now there's multiple factors to that, but in the end I decided that I actually think it can increase the value of my game quite a bit. And for me, I think it was incredibly easy to actually implement, because I already had what I call a toast system in my game. As in, like, you interact with something or you click on something and there will be like a subtitle showing up as if the player is saying it. So I even had the lines in first person as if the character was saying it, just that it was only a subtitle you would read. And then, of course, I did the thing where I had the, a little typing effect instead. So literally all I had to do, as soon as I had the voice recordings, is to, maybe slight oversimplification, but I switched out the sound effect from typing to the actual voice line. I had all the triggers done, all the lines were done. Like it actually ended up being one of the simplest implementations so far.
Yeah, it's crazy how it goes sometimes, yeah. And it has a huge impact on a project, yeah. For sure. So maybe it's time for the last one. The last one is, so if you do realize you're working on something, or maybe your project is like stuck in this scope creep infested loop or whatever, how do you think you get out of it? I mean, it strongly depends on each project, but yeah, what do you think?
So the setup here, first of all, is that you have, just that I think that is the hardest part, but at this point you have figured out that something is scope creep. And in that case, I would say it does depend a little bit, because I do think it's, if I think about like my battery system again, I think one thing that could be valuable is to maybe consider why you tried this idea in the first place. Because in that context, I realized that there was an actual issue I wanted to solve, or it was something that I actually thought would increase the value of the game. I just picked the wrong implementations. And at that point, I think that the solution would be to, try the other implementation, if there is one that actually fits. And if not that, then I think it's the, kill your darlings. You just gotta chop it off, get it out of there.
Right. I think you really hit the nail on the head here. You're saying, what problem are you solving? This is a very big question. Because, I mean, sometimes so let's maybe talk about Easter eggs, right? If you're adding Easter eggs, I think having Easter eggs is by definition scope creep. I don't know, what do you think?
What did you say?
An Easter egg is by definition scope creep. What do you think?
I'm not sure if I agree with that, because I think depending on the game, I think some games can actually get a lot of value out of having little secrets or Easter eggs and so on. Now, I do think it does depend on the game. I think maybe mine is actually one of those games where I think having little lore Easter eggs or little secrets here and there and so on actually increases the value quite a bit. It nurtures that curiosity about the world. So I'm not sure I would always consider specifically Easter eggs to be the scope creep. Why do you think that?
I'm just gonna say because sometimes when I think Easter eggs can be part of the core design. For example, you mentioned, for example, a Metroidvania kind of needs to have secrets because it's kind of like it is part of the identity of the genre almost. But if you're adding like an Easter egg where you type a certain word in the splash screen, it's like, who is it gonna really see at some point? I don't know. Is that scope creep, or is it just you having fun because you need to kind of vent and have a day off to do serious game dev work? I don't know. It depends. I guess one of the I'm trying to think of the biggest Easter egg that I implemented. One of the biggest Easter eggs that I implemented was kind of a tunnel that you walk through, and every step you play kind of a different piano sound, and you can walk through it for a very long time. So you play this really long song, and it actually loops, and it adds up to 3 layers the longer you go on. I think that was one of the Easter eggs where I'm like, you know what? I really enjoyed implementing it. But how much value it's gonna add? I'm not really sure.
No, I think that's a fair take, because I think in my game I do have a few of those. I have a few things that I've implemented I would consider Easter eggs, which I am honestly unsure if people are ever going to find. Where and for those, you could argue it gets tricky, because I think if somebody does end up finding that little Easter egg or secret or whatever, I think that would be a really cool experience for that player. But it is probably fair to say that like 99.9% of players are going to play through the entire game and never see this. And, you know, with that in mind, yeah, maybe you could argue it's more so in the scope, in the vicinity of scope creep, you know?
Yeah, but for those 1% people, it's gonna be a really cool thing, because they will feel really special, and that's, I guess, kind of part of why I make games, right? I was thinking of another example where a friend of mine was working on a racing game, and he was trying to implement. No, wait a minute. It was multiplayer only, and at some point he was trying to figure out a single player AI for the cars, right? And he was so stuck on it because he thought of this huge class and, you know, the very complex node system and whatever. And I'm like, and he really, I think he was like stuck on it for a month or two. And I told him, you know what, you really just sit down and think of the simplest way of making a car AI. What is the first thing that you need to do? As soon as the racing starts, the car needs to drive. That is the first thing it needs to do. And then you can figure out what happens if it goes into a corner. Well, just put like a corner node there or whatever that it drives towards. So you have like this array of nodes that it just straight up drives towards the next node. And then you have a racetrack that it just drives around. And that's it. You have the simplest AI racing, the racing AI that you can implement. And he's like, oh yeah, and then it's like within one day he had like a racing guy, and then you can work from there, you know. It's, I think sometimes I do notice this a lot, sometimes people start from the most complex solution to the problems, and then they get stuck somewhere because it is very complex. Maybe it's above the current level or whatever, because to do this, they would have to learn X and Y and Z, and they're not there yet. But I think really sitting down and again, like before sitting down and planning it out and seeing, okay, what can I do with my current skills, also could get you out of scope creep, because then it's like, oh yeah, I cannot do this, but what can I do instead? And would still work in terms of making the game like valuable or making it workable for the game. I think that's also one thing you can do. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think often and I think this is human to some extent, like it's just part of being a human. It's very easy to get a little bit of tunnel vision on the entire complex system or whatever it is, and like the end result of it. And that can feel kind of unmanageable. I think like in game dev and in a lot of ventures in general, like actually trying to break it down into like, what is the first step? Like, what is the simplest thing I can do now? And then I can figure out like how to actually improve it or whatever it might be.
We also mentioned playtest before, and I think another crucial component in, first of all, finding that you're in a scope creep and getting out of it is finding other game devs and talking to them about your project. Because sometimes, because you mentioned tunnel vision, that triggered that for me. Sometimes talking to other game devs who are maybe at the same level as you are, or maybe a bit above, and you tell them about your problem, and then they will look at you like with you know, like this, and they're like, why don't you just do X, or why don't you just do Y? And it's like, oh my God, you're right. It's that is something that happened to me a lot, even for Faith and Despair. I'm gonna give you one example. I think I mentioned this in the previous podcast as well, but at the beginning, I was like, I'm never gonna add art to the game because I don't know how. But at some point, I don't know who I was talking to, but they really said, you know what, you need to kind of figure out how to add art to the game. And that really jump-started me, because I was like, wait a minute, there's so much art lying around. Basically, there's so many artists who want to have the art in a game, who are maybe open to collaborate. And so I was like, oh, I don't hire somebody to draw all of these, and then it takes 10 years to maker of these, which is a lot of work, right, for an artist. Give an artist a task to make 50 images. It is a lot of work. And so I was like, okay, I just looked around, asked artists, and then that was basically a solved problem. But that took me a long time, first of all, to realize, and to get to a state where I'm like, okay, this is actually rather simple. You just talk to people. I know it's hard for certain people to get out there and talk to people. It was for me at first too. But yeah, so I think the learning from this is talk to peers, talk to other game devs, and tell them the problems, and maybe because of tunnel vision, as you said, maybe they will give you a bit of a solution there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely something valuable, because it's like you never know if the person you're speaking to has battled a very similar issue as to the one you're currently working on. And, it basically goes back to the whole, like, there's no reason to reinvent the wheel, right? Someone might, like, you might be able to skip doing all of these mistakes or whatever it might be and just arrive at a good solution by taking some guidance from someone else, whether that's a peer or, whatever it might be.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good point.
So, what would be the final one, or the final topic that we would like to discuss? Or do you think we have outscoped?
So we talked about the definition of scope, and in terms of our projects, and overall how to realize when you suffer from it and how to get back on track. Yeah, I don't know if we ran through most of it, to be honest.
We ran through most of it, yes.
Yeah, we underestimated the scope of, or we overestimated the scope of the topic.
There we go, yes. I mean, that is something that we also got to learn along the way, I guess.
Absolutely.
This is something that happens to me sometimes. Sometimes people bring suggestions to me, and I go through it in my head of what I would have to do for this to implement. And then I'm like, it sounds really good, but I'm not gonna do it. I'm so sorry, but this is completely out of scope for me. Now, this is another thing where probably could be solved by thinking it through, and maybe it's not that big of a deal. But here's why, I just wanted to say that with experience, you can kind of estimate these things. But I'm going to be honest, I still have no idea. Every time something comes along, I always estimate it or underestimate it.
I definitely think it is something that you do get better at, whether it's like gauging the time it's going to take to implement something or the impact it's going to have and so on. I did realize one thing that might actually be a good proactive thing to do to try and not fall for the scope creep. I think something that has helped me quite a lot is also being, I work a lot with constraints, and I think that helps me a lot. Like the fact that I have, I would basically put it as I have a lot of very strict rules about what I can and can't do in my game. And a lot of the time, I would say that makes it very easy for me to sometimes rule stuff off as like, I won't have time to implement this. Like, an example of that is, obviously, I have a very limited color palette. I probably every other week or so get a question about adding, like, another color to my game. And that's one of those things where, like, it sounds like a very simple, small, minute thing, right? But I actually think, for me personally, I think it's easy to underestimate how much work that might be, because for me, one of my core design pillars is consistency. One of the things I value the most is that I want stuff in my game to be consistent across the board. So when it comes to something like, in this specific case, it would be great if we could just add a bit of green, And then, but then the way I start thinking is, okay, but then I don't only want to have green in one specific singular circumstance in the game, because that feels out of place and odd. So then I need to start figuring out, like, okay, where else can I add this color? And all of a sudden I'm realizing that, like, I'm gonna have to, like, make up new excuses to put this color in more places just to make it feel consistent. I'm like, I'm not gonna do this, you know?
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
And maybe it sounds silly, just obviously I have like 7 colors in my game, so it's already very limited, but I think it helps me keep a bit on track, you know?
Yeah, I think you're right on that, because constraints is kind of like having a plan or having a vision almost, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, I would say so.
And so that really is helping you, stay on track. Yes, absolutely.
Because I think sometimes the proposal from a player also might sound very simple. Like, it sounds like, oh, it's like in Sprite, literally click on a new color and add it, and then that's it. But I think when you consider the whole picture of it, it can actually have more impact than just that. Same thing with, like, I don't have dragging in my game. It's a very literal point and click. There's not a single place in the game where you drag something. That's like, I don't know, maybe it would have been better to have it, but I'm like super strict about it. So whenever it's like a question of, oh, maybe here you should make it so you can drag this thing instead, I literally just view that as, if I'm allowed to be a bit hyperbolic, like, it's just illegal to me. Like, I'm not allowed to do it.
Nice.
But it's because I think it's also one of those things that is more scope creep than it might seem. Because, yeah, it starts with, oh yeah, just this one puzzle, like, maybe here you can drag this thing. But then it's like, okay, I have 20 other puzzles where maybe you should drag it, maybe you shouldn't. And then the question becomes, how do I clearly explain to the player when they're supposed to drag something and when they're supposed to click on something? How does the player know? How do I make that, like, consistent? And I think, this is something I have contemplated quite a bit. Going through that throughout the entire game, I'm like, I actually think it's a much bigger feature than people give credit for. If, with, like, consistency and clarity for the player in mind.
I completely agree. Like, having support for both systems, clicking and pointing and clicking, as well as dragging, is you have to account for a lot of edge cases. I have done it for Fate in Despair because I've seen people, wanting to drag cards because it feels good. But I've also seen people that click on cards and then click on an enemy or whatever. So I kind of, like, just from seeing playtests, I was like, oh my God, I need to support both cases. And that was a rabbit hole, absolutely.
I think
with
maybe
this game, I think
that's a good way to tackle it, though, because you could argue that it is intuitive then, because whichever one the player tries, it is going to work. But I think it depends a lot on the exact, the exact thing you're talking about. I think with it was still a lot of work for you to support both of those systems. But from, like, the player perspective, I feel like it feels intuitive whether you click and place or drag it into place.
Yeah, I think that was actually a point I wanted to make. The thing that happened here was the expectations carried over from other games in the same genre. So if you were playing, for example, Slay the Spire or whatever, or Monster Train, I think in both of these games you can do both. You can both drag and also click and point and click. So when you work in an established genre, you kind of have to carry over those expectations and implement those as well. I think this is also a kind of a must-have, because otherwise people will leave negative reviews if you don't fulfill expectations of the same genre. Which in terms of point and click adventures, I think that's totally fine, right? I don't think a lot of people would expect dragging there, or maybe it's like a small percentage.
Yeah, I think it does happen. There's definitely places in my game where I can sometimes notice a player try to drag something. And looking at similar games, if I take something like Rusty Lake, for example, the Rusty Lake series, I know they have like puzzles here and there where you do drag something. But then they might also need to have like a actual UI element show up to like show you that you're supposed to drag this. And, you know, for me, that's another one of my very strict rules. I want to have as little UI as possible to, you know, encourage immersion for the game. And I think, like, in my case, what makes me feel fairly confident that this is a good decision is that, yes, there might be a place here or there where a player is going to try and drag something. But when I never, throughout the entire game, allow them to drag something, they're gonna figure that out fairly quickly, you know, because
I think so too.
Yeah, because then it's like, after a while, it inherently is going to be obvious that you just can't drag stuff in this game because it never works. Whereas the issue if I would support both, I think, is that like I just don't know how to make it intuitive which one you're supposed to do in which case, you know, because there's a lot of moments where I think I couldn't allow them to do both. And in that case, how do I actually explain it? I think it becomes a really tricky like design question.
Mm-hmm. And it becomes very confusing for the player as well, which is not good. Absolutely.
Mm.
It is also because in your game, it is not the main part of the game. That is also something that you're taking into consideration, right? Because the inventory, like you do not, like interacting with items is not something you do very often. Like the main game is clicking on the backgrounds, clicking on items on the background, right?
Yeah, I would say so. It's like exploring the environment and like just clicking to interact with things here and there. Because that's what I would say, maybe, I don't know if that sounds lame, but that's basically the core mechanic in the game, right? It's the thing the player interacts with the most. And I think maybe that's, I assume that's the point you're making. I think that's different in your game where the cards is the thing players most often interact with. And I think maybe it's more expected there that you should be able to drag them as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the, I think this is the last example. The one thing that really cemented that I had to implement dragging as well is that people select a card and then they just drag it a little bit. So they kind of, you know, have this tentative consideration of maybe playing the card and then they're putting it back. So they kind of want to hold it and, you know, think about playing it. And it's like, am I going to play it? And then they put it back into the hand and then they're dragging the next one. So this is kind of part of the thinking process or part of strategizing, where they just drag this card out of the hand. So they kind of bookmark it in the mind. Yeah, this is the card I want to play, but what are the other options currently? And then they're putting it back. I think this is kind of part of it. I don't know.
No, I actually think that makes a lot of sense because it basically allows the player to kind of practically or like visually think out what they want to do. Do you allow, I can't remember straight off the top of my head, do you allow reordering the cards in your hand as well?
No. You
don't? Okay.
That is scope creep.
Fair enough.
That is scope creep.
Why?
You would, I mean, thinking about it, you would probably have to. Anyways, I think this is the end of the episode. Why don't you take us to the finish line?
I think we've gone on long enough. This has been another episode of Feature Complete,
where we talk about game dev and everything related to it.
We will be back in 2 weeks again. So until then, thank you guys very much for watching.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.